Some encounters changed the way people see the world. The day Lars Whitmore and his companions rode into Apache territory, their hair catching sunlight like pale gold. Nobody could have predicted what would follow. The women stopped their work mid-motion, hands frozen over stretched hides and grinding stones. They had never seen men like that. Men whose hair held the color of dry grass, whose eyes reflected the sky itself, and they couldn't look away. What started as simple curiosity would spiral into something far more dangerous, something that would force both worlds to confront what happens when fascination becomes impossible to ignore. Because in that moment, when the first Apache woman met Lars's gaze and held it a second too long, everything began to shift. The three riders appeared on their Jeline just before midday, their silhouettes dark against the harsh brightness behind them. Laos rode in front, his companions flanking him on either side, all three sharing that same unsettling paleness that marked them as different. They had been traveling for weeks through territories that seemed to fold into themselves, where landmarks disappeared overnight and water sources dried up without warning. Now they needed passage through lands they knew were claimed, lands where strangers were rarely welcome. Lars pulled his horse to a stop, studying the valley below. Smoke rose in thin columns from an encampment nestled against a rocky outcropping. Protection from wind on three sides. Clear sight lines in all directions. Smart placement. These people knew how to read the land, how to make themselves part of it rather than fighting against it. He respected that. What he didn't expect was the reaction as they descended the slope, moving slowly to signal peaceful intent. Movement erupted in the camp. Below, not the scramble of defense, not warriors rushing for weapons. Instead, women emerged from shelters, their work forgotten, their faces turned upward toward the approaching riders. Even from this distance, Lars could feel the weight of their stares, could sense something shifting in the air between them. His companion, a younger man named Emil, shifted nervously in his saddle. They're watching us. I know. Not like usual. Not like they're checking for weapons or counting our numbers. They're just staring. Lars had noticed. In all his years crossing territories, negotiating passage through lands claimed by those who had every right to be suspicious, he had never felt attention quite like this. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was something else entirely, something that made his skin prickle with awareness. They reached level ground, and Lars raised his hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The camp had gone eerily still. Women stood in small clusters there, dark eyes fixed on the riders with an intensity that bordered on unsettling. Some whispered to each other, heads tilted close, but their gazes never wavered. A few younger women had moved closer, drawn forward despite themselves, their curiosity overriding whatever caution they'd been taught. Then the men appeared. Warriors emerged from the shadows between shelters, their faces carved from stone, their postures radiating controlled threat. They positioned themselves between the riders and the women, a human barrier that communicated clear intent. One man stepped forward, taller than the others, his presence commanding immediate attention. His hand rested on the knife at his belt, not threatening, but ready, always ready. Lars recognized authority when he saw it. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed, someone whose word carried weight. And right now, that man was looking at Lars with the kind of cold assessment usually reserved for threats that needed eliminating. "We're just passing through," Lars said, keeping his voice level and calm. "We mean no harm. Just need safe passage to the northern range." The warrior's eyes narrowed, flicking from Lars to his companions, then past them to where the women still watched with unnatural focus. Something hardened in his expression, something that looked dangerously close to anger. When he spoke, his voice was deep and carried across the space between them with crystal clarity. "You should not have come here." The words hung in the air, loaded with meanings Lars couldn't quite decipher. Behind a line of warriors, one of the women took a half step forward before another pulled her back. Lars caught a glimpse of her face, young, fierce, with eyes that held a strange mixture of curiosity and challenge. She didn't look away when their eyes met. Instead, she held his gaze with an intensity that made something tighten in his chest. And in that moment, Lars understood. This wasn't about passage or territory or even the usual suspicions that greeted strangers. This was about something far more volatile, something that had already begun the moment they'd appeared on that ridgeline. The tall warrior stepped forward, closing the distance between them with deliberate purpose. His hand remained on his knife, and every line of his body communicated threat. "The women do not look at you. You do not look at them. You leave now." But even as he spoke, Lars could feel those eyes still on him, could sense the attention that refused to be commanded. Away. The warrior felt it too. Lars could see it in the way his jaw tightened in the flash of something dangerous crossing his face. This was already spiraling beyond simple negotiation. Whatever was happening here, whatever had been set in motion by their arrival, it had moved past Lars's control. And the look on the warrior's face suggested it wouldn't take much for this tense standoff to explode into something far worse. Behind the wall of warriors, the young woman with the fierce eyes whispered something to her companion, her gaze still locked on Laos. And in the space between one breath and the next, he realized that leaving might not be as simple as riding back up that ridge, because some things once seen can't be unseen, and some curiosities once awakened refuse to be put back to sleep. Lars raised both hands slowly, palms open, showing he carried no weapon in his grip. The gesture was meant to calm, to signal surrender if necessary. But the tall warrior's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened further, his jaw tightening as his eyes flicked past Lars to where the women still watched from behind the protective line of men. "Well, go," Lars said, keeping his voice steady. "We don't want trouble." He started to turn his horse. Emil and the third rider following his lead. They had moved perhaps 10 feet when Emil's horse stumbled, favoring its right front leg badly. The animal's head dropped, and it refused to put weight on the injured hoof. Emil dismounted quickly, running his hand down the horse's leg with practiced efficiency. "Stone bruise," Emil said quietly, his face tight with concern. "Bad one. He can't carry me. Not for miles." Lars felt the situation shift around them. Leaving had been their best option, their only safe option. But now that door had closed, he turned back to face the warrior, whose expression had transformed into something dangerous. The man understood what this meant. The strangers would need to stay longer, and every additional minute felt like kindling stacked around a fire already burning too hot. "The horse is injured," Lars said, gesturing to the animal. "We need to rest it. A few hours, maybe. Less. Then we'll leave." The warrior's hand tightened on his knife handle. For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes boring into Lars with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Around them, other warriors had moved closer, forming a tighter circle. Their faces showed the same cold assessment, the same barely controlled hostility. Behind them, one of the women spoke, a quick, urgent phrase in their language. The fierce young woman Lars had noticed before. She gestured toward the injured horse, then to a spot near the edge of camp, speaking rapidly. Several other women nodded, adding their voices to hers. The tall warrior turned sharply, his response harsh and clipped. The young woman didn't back down. Instead, she stepped forward past the line of warriors, her chin raised in defiance. She looked directly at Lars, then back to the warrior, and spoke again slower, this time more deliberate. Whatever she said made several of the older women murmur agreement. The warrior's face darkened. He barked something that sounded like a command, but the young woman held her ground. For several heartbeats, they locked eyes, a battle of wills playing out in front of everyone. Finally, the warrior turned away, his entire body radiating anger barely held in check. "You stay at the edge of camp," he said to Lars, his accent thick, but his meaning crystal clear. "You do not approach the women. You do not speak to them. You do not look at them. When the sun drops halfway, you leave. If you are still here when darkness comes, you will not see morning." It wasn't an invitation. It was a threat wrapped in the thinnest veneer of tolerance. But it was permission to stay, however grudging. Lars nodded slowly, accepting the terms. Without argument, he knew better than to push boundaries already stretched dangerously thin. The warrior pointed to a spot far from the main camp, a cluster of rocks that offered some shade but kept them isolated. There, nowhere else. As Lars led his horse toward the designated area, he felt every eye in the camp tracking his movement. The warriors watched with open suspicion, and the women watched with something else entirely. That same intense curiosity that had started all of this. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, but he could feel the weight of their attention like heat against his skin. Emil walked his injured horse slowly, the animal limping badly with each step. The third rider, a quiet man named Henrik, dismounted and began checking his own horse's hooves, clearly nervous about finding himself trapped in a situation spiraling beyond anyone's control. They reached the rocks, and Lars finally allowed himself to glance back at the camp. The warriors had returned to their positions, but their postures remained tense, alert, and standing at the edge of the women's area, still visible despite the efforts to shield her, was the young woman who had spoken up. She was looking directly at him, her expression unreadable, but her gaze unwavering. Lars turned away quickly, focusing on unsaddling his horse, but the damage was done. In that brief moment of eye contact, something had passed between them, some wordless acknowledgement that this situation was far from over and the tall warrior had seen it. Lars didn't need to look to. No, he could feel the weight of that murderous stare from across the camp. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the hours ahead suddenly felt very long, because trapped here, unable to leave, with tensions already at breaking point. Lars realized they weren't just waiting for a horse to heal. They were sitting on top of something explosive, and the fuse was already lit. The sun had moved a hand's width across the sky when Lars first noticed her approaching. Not the young woman he expected, but an older one carrying a clay vessel. She moved with purpose, her weathered face neutral, giving nothing away. The warriors watched but didn't intervene, apparently bringing water to unwanted guests fell within acceptable boundaries. She set the vessel down at the edge of their rock shelter without meeting Lars's eyes, then turned to leave. But before she did, she spoke a single word that sounded like a warning, though Lars couldn't understand the language. Her eyes flicked toward the main camp, then back to him, and the meaning was clear enough. "Stay away." Lars nodded his understanding. The woman left, and he shared the water with Emil and Henrik, all three of them drinking sparingly. The injured horse had improved slightly, able to put some weight on the hoof, but not enough to travel. They needed more time. Time they might not have. An hour passed, then another. The camp had settled into an uneasy rhythm. People returning to their tasks, but with frequent glances toward the strangers at the rocks. Lars tried to rest to ignore the constant scrutiny, but his instincts kept him alert. Something felt wrong. The air itself seemed charged, waiting for a spark. When a young woman appeared, walking deliberately toward their position, Lars felt his stomach tighten with warning. She moved openly, not hiding her intention, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Behind her, Lars could see the tall warrior rise to his feet, his body going rigid with barely controlled fury. "Don't," Henrik whispered urgently. "Don't even look at her." But the woman kept coming, and turning away would be an insult of its own kind. Lars stood slowly, keeping his hands visible, tried to communicate through posture alone that he understood how dangerous this was. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising her voice. Up close, Lars could see she was younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 20, with striking features and eyes that blazed with intelligence and determination. She held out the wrapped cloth. "Food," she said in heavily accented English, the word clearly rehearsed. "For travel." Lars didn't reach for it immediately. "Your leader told me not to speak with you." Takakota tells many things. Her mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to defiance. "I am Ayana. I speak who I choose." Behind her, Takakota had started moving, his stride eating up the distance between them with frightening speed. Lars could see other warriors following, their faces set in hard lines. This was about to explode into violence, and there wasn't a thing he could do to stop it. "You need to go," Lars said quietly, urgently. "Now before." "Before what?" Ayana's eyes flashed. "Before Takakota decides I need protecting from strangers who do nothing but wait within your horse." She set the cloth bundle on the ground between them with deliberate care. "I protect myself." Takakota arrived like a storm, grabbing Ayana's arm and pulling her back with barely restrained force. He positioned himself between her and Lars, his entire body vibrating with rage. When he spoke, the words came out in a torrent of their language, harsh and cutting. Ayana responded with equal fire, her voice rising to match his. Lars stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, making no move that could be interpreted as threatening. Emil and Henrik had moved to flank him, their faces pale, but their postures non-confrontational. They understood the precariousness of their position. One wrong move, one misread gesture, and this would turn into bloodshed. Takakota turned his fury on Lars, switching to broken English. "You bring curse here. You make women forget honor, forget their place. This is why you must go. We're leaving as soon as the horse can travel," Lars said calmly. "We want no trouble. Trouble already here." Takakota gestured sharply at Ayana, who had crossed her arms and planted her feet, clearly refusing to be sent away like a child. "She never disobey before you come. Others talk, they whisper, they look. This is your doing." Lars wanted to argue that he hadn't asked for any of this. That mere appearance shouldn't cause such disruption. But he understood the real issue wasn't about him at all. It was about control slipping away, about ancient structures being questioned because of what his presence represented. Difference, possibility, the world beyond the boundaries they'd carefully maintained. "I'm sorry," Lars said, and meant it. "We'll be gone before nightfall. The horse is improving." Dakota studied him with barely disguised contempt, then turned back to Ayana, speaking rapidly in their language. She responded with a single word, sharp and definitive, then walked away, not back toward the women's area, but to a different part of camp entirely, her spine straight and her head high. Takakota watched her go, something cracking in his carefully controlled expression. When he looked back at Lars, the hatred in his eyes had deepened into something more dangerous, something personal. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If you still hear, when sun touches earth, I kill you myself. Her honor, our honor, demands blood." He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and walked away, leaving the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Around the camp, Lars could see other warriors gathering, their attention focused entirely on the strangers at the rocks. The protection of temporary hospitality had evaporated. Now they were just targets waiting for darkness to fall, and the sun was already beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. Emil worked frantically on the horse's hoof, trying to speed the healing that couldn't be rushed. Henrik checked their supplies, calculating how fast they could travel if they had to make a run for it on two horses, one man riding double. Lars stood watch, tracking the sun's position with growing dread. They had maybe 2 hours before the ultimatum expired. The camp had grown quieter as afternoon stretched toward evening, but the silence felt wrong, expectant, like the stillness before thunder. Warriors moved with purpose, checking weapons, gathering in small groups with their heads bent close. Lars didn't need to understand their language to know what they were discussing. Then, a child's scream shattered the tension. Lars's head snapped toward the sound, instinct overriding caution. A small girl, maybe 6 years old, had wandered beyond the camp's boundary and was backing away from a rattlesnake coiled in the rocks, its tail buzzing a deadly warning. She was too terrified to move properly, her feet stumbling over loose stones as she tried to retreat. The snake struck. The child fell backward, the snake's fangs missing her leg by inches as she tumbled. Out of range, but now she was on the ground, still too close, and the snake was repositioning for another strike. The girl's scream had frozen into breathless terror. Her eyes locked on the creature that meant her death. Laos moved without thinking. He covered the distance in seconds, grabbing a long stick as he ran. He reached the girl, just as the snake coiled to strike again, using the stick to pin its head against the rock with precise force. The snake thrashed violently, its body whipping against his arm with bruising impact, but Lars held firm. With his free hand, he grabbed the girl and lifted her away, passing her to the women who had finally reached them, their faces white with fear. Henrik arrived and dispatched the snake with his knife. The threat ended, but Lars barely registered it. He was breathing hard, his heart hammering, the reality of what had just happened settling over him like cold water. He had crossed into their territory without permission, had touched one of their children, had inserted himself into their business in the most direct way possible. He turned to find every warrior in the camp facing him, weapons drawn. Takakota strode forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. The girl's mother clutched her daughter, checking for bites with shaking hands, whispering urgent prayers of gratitude. But Takakota's attention was fixed entirely on Lars. He stopped 3 ft away, close enough that Lars could see the war playing out behind his eyes. The knowledge that Lars had saved a child's life versus the violation of trust. The intrusion that custom demanded he answer with violence. "You should not have done that," Takakota said, his voice deadly quiet. "Would you rather I watch her die? You crossed the boundary. You touched one of ours. You prove you have no respect." Lars met his gaze steadily. "I respect life. That's all that mattered in that moment." The girl's mother spoke then, her voice breaking as she clutched her daughter. She addressed Takakota directly, her words tumbling out in a rush of emotion. Other women joined her, their voices rising in what sounded like defense, like argument against the sentence. Everyone knew Takakota wanted to deliver. Ayana pushed through the crowd, her face fierce with determination. She spoke rapidly, gesturing to Lars, to the dead snake, to the crying child. Her voice carried authority despite her youth, and several of the older women nodded agreement with whatever she was saying. Takakota's jaw worked, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked at Lars with barely contained violence, then at the women whose voices had risen in defense of the stranger, then at the little girl who still trembled in her mother's arms. The math was impossible. Custom demanded one thing, gratitude demanded another, and the two couldn't coexist. "You leave now," Takakota said finally. Each word, forced out like broken glass. Horse heels or not, you go. Before sun sets. Completely before I change mind, it wasn't mercy. It was the only option he could live with, and it clearly cost him to offer it. Lars nodded slowly, understanding that this was the best outcome they could hope for. But as he turned to gather his companions, Ayana caught his eye. She stood at the edge of the crowd, separated from him by dozens of people and an unbridgeable cultural divide. For just a moment, her expression softened into something that looked almost like regret. She raised one hand slightly, a gesture so small it could have been imagined. But Lars knew it wasn't. It was goodbye, and it was thank you, and it was acknowledgement of everything that couldn't be said or acted upon in this life. In this place between these two worlds, Lars turned away before Takakota could see the exchange, before he could give the warrior any more reason to break his fragile restraint. They would leave. Now, injured horse or not, they would push through the pain in the distance, because staying meant death. But as he mounted his horse and led his companions away from the camp, Lars couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something unfinished behind, something that would haunt the empty spaces of his thoughts for years to come. They rode in silence as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and rushed. Emil's horse limped badly, each step clearly painful. But the animal pushed forward because it had no choice. None of them did. Behind them, the Apache camp disappeared into the folds of the land, becoming just another shadow among many. Lars tried to focus on the path ahead, on finding shelter before full darkness fell, on putting distance between them and the danger they'd barely escaped. But his mind kept circling back to Ayana's face, to that final gesture of farewell, to the weight of all the words that would never be spoken. That was close, Henrik said finally, breaking the oppressive quiet. Too close. Emil nodded, his attention on his struggling horse. Another hour, and Takakota would have made good on his threat. We wouldn't have seen morning. Lars said nothing. They were right, of course. They had survived by the narrowest of margins, saved only by a child's near death and the intervention of women whose voices had carried unexpected weight. But survival felt hollow, somehow incomplete. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles when Lars noticed the rider. A single figure, small and quick, moving parallel to their path through the broken terrain to their left. The failing light made details difficult, but Lars's instincts told him who it was before his eyes confirmed it. Ayana rode with practiced skill, her horse navigating the rocky ground with sure-footed confidence. We got company, Henrik said, his hand moving to his rifle. One rider following us. Don't, Lars said sharply. Don't reach for weapons. Ayana angled her path to intersect theirs, pulling her horse to a stop on a low rise about 30 feet away. She sat perfectly still, silhouetted against the darkening sky, making no move to come closer. The message was clear. She wanted to speak, but on neutral ground at a distance that couldn't be misinterpreted. Las Dismundu slowly, handing his reins to Emil. Stay here, Lars. Emil's voice carried warning. This is a bad idea. Everything about today has been a bad idea. Lars started, walking toward the rise, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. One more won't make much difference. He stopped at the base of the small hill, maintaining the distance Ayana had established. Up close, he could see her face more clearly in the fading light, the set of her jaw, the intensity in her dark eyes, the conflict written in every line of her posture. You should not have come after us, Lars said quietly. I did not come after you. Ayana's English was halting but determined. I came to say what I cannot say there, what no one will speak. She paused, searching for words in a language that wasn't her own. You save child today. You show honor. But Takakota, he cannot see this. He sees only threat. I understand his position. No, she cut him off, her voice sharp. You do not understand. Takakota fears you because of me. Because when I look at you, I forget to look away. Because other women, they do same. We see something we never see before. And it makes us curious, makes us question. She gestured broadly, encompassing the invisible weight of tradition. Questions are dangerous things for women in my world. Lars felt something tighten in his chest. I never meant to cause problems for you. I know this, but problems come anyway. Ayana's expression shifted, becoming almost sad. Before you. Come, I accept my path. I know what my life will be. Who I marry, what I do, how I live. All decided, all clear. But then I see you, and I think there are other ways, other choices, other worlds beyond what I'm told to see. She paused. This thinking is poison to peace. This is why Takakota hates you. Not because of what you do, but because of what you make us imagine. The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither could fully address. Lars understood then that their brief encounter had been more than just cultural collision. It had been a crack in carefully maintained walls, a glimpse through barriers meant to remain solid and unquestioned. What will happen to you? Lars asked. When you go back, Takakota will be angry, but he cannot punish me for saving your life with my words. The council will speak for me. Because of a child, I will survive. She smiled slightly, but without real humor. I always survive, but I will not forget. This is my curse now, to know there are other ways, even if I cannot walk them. Lars wanted to say something meaningful, something that would acknowledge the significance of this moment without making promises neither of them could keep. But words felt inadequate against the reality of their situation. Two people from incompatible worlds, connected by nothing more than a few hours of impossible tension in one moment of perfect understanding. Thank you, he said finally, for speaking for us, for helping us leave alive. Ayana nodded once, accepting the gratitude. Then she turned her horse, preparing to ride back into the gathering darkness. Back to the life she'd momentarily questioned. But she stopped, looking back over her shoulder. You will forget. This, she said. In time, it will become just strange story you tell. But I will. Remember. I will remember that there are men with hair like sun and eyes like sky, and that one of them showed me that. Honor has no tribe. She rode away then, her form melting into the shadows as quickly as she'd appeared. Lars watched until he could no longer distinguish her from the landscape, until she became just another part of the vast emptiness surrounding them. When he returned to his companions, neither Emil nor Henrik asked what had been said. They simply mounted their horses and continued riding, putting more distance between themselves and the camp, between themselves and the complications they'd accidentally created. But Lars carried those words with him into the darkness. Knowing that Ayana was wrong about one thing, he wouldn't forget. Some encounters mark a person too deeply to ever fully fade, leaving impressions that last longer than the moment that created them. They made camp 3 hours past the Apache territory in a shallow canyon that offered protection from wind and concealment from anyone who might have followed. Emil's horse had worsened during the hard ride, barely able to walk now, and they had no choice but to stop. The animal needed rest, and truthfully, so did they. Lars built a small fire while Henrik tended the injured horse, wrapping the swollen hoof with strips of cloth soaked in cold water from their cantons. Emil kept watch, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. None of them spoke much. The day's events sat heavy on all of them, but heaviest on Lars. He kept seeing Ayana's face in the firelight, the way she'd looked at him during that final conversation, the weight of realization in her eyes when she'd admitted that his presence had cracked something open inside her world. He had never meant to be an agent of disruption, had never intended to make Anyone questioned their place or purpose. But intentions mattered little against the reality of what had happened. You, thinking about her, Emil asked quietly, breaking the silence. Lars didn't pretend to misunderstand. Yeah, nothing good comes from that path. Emil poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night. Two different worlds. No way to bridge that gap. I know, but you're still thinking about it. Lars was saved from answering by Henrik's sharp whistle, their signal for danger. All three men rose instantly, weapons ready, eyes straining against the darkness. Henrik pointed to the canyon rim above them, where movement suggested multiple figures positioned along the high ground. How many? Lars asked, his voice barely above a whisper. At least 5, maybe more. Henrik's hand was steady on his rifle. They got us surrounded. Lars felt his stomach sink. Takakota had changed his mind. Or perhaps he'd never intended to let them leave at all. Maybe allowing them to depart had simply been strategy. Easier to eliminate them away from the women and children, away from witnesses who might object. We can't fight our way out of this, Emil said, reading the tactical situation with grim accuracy. High ground, superior numbers, darkness on their side. Lars raised his hands slowly, stepping into the firelight, where he could be clearly seen. We mean no harm, he called out in English, hoping someone up there understood. We left as you demanded. We kept our word. Silence answered him. Then a figure separated from the shadows above, descending the canyon wall with practiced ease. Not Takakota, not a warrior at all. An older woman, her. Silver hair braided with leather cord, her face weathered by decades of sun and hardship. She reached the canyon floor and approached their fire with absolute confidence, as if she owned every step she took. Behind her, more figures descended. All women, Lars realized with shock. 5 of them, ranging from middle-aged to elderly, all moving with purpose. No warriors, no Takakota, just women who had followed them into the darkness for reasons Lars couldn't begin to guess. The silver-haired woman stopped at the edge of their fire's light and studied Lars with sharp, assessing eyes. When she spoke, her English was better than Ayana's, shaped by years of trading with outsiders. You saved a child today, she said without preamble. This creates debt. Lars shook his head. No debt. Any man would have not. Any man. Many would watch and do nothing to avoid offense. You chose child over safety. This matters. She reached into the leather bag at her side and withdrew something wrapped in hide. We bring medicine for injured horse, and we bring warning. She set the hide-wrapped bundle on the ground between them, her movements deliberate. The other women had formed a loose circle around the camp, not threatening, but clearly establishing control of the situation. What warning? Lars asked, tension coiling in his chest. Takakota is angry. More than you know. Ayana, she defies him tonight. She says she will not marry. Man he has chosen for her. She says she has seen there are other ways to live, other choices women can make. The old woman's expression was impossible to read. This is your fault, and this is also gift. But gifts that break open old ways always come with blood. Lars felt ice flood his veins. Is she safe? Will Takakota? Takakota cannot touch her. Council protects her because she spoke truth in defense of strangers who saved child. But he will not forget and he will not forgive. You understand? You are marked now. If you ever return to these lands, if you ever cross Apache territory again, he will kill you. No warnings, no mercy, just death. The woman picked up a stick and scratched marks in the dirt. A crude map showing routes and boundaries. You go this way, north, then east. You stay away from our lands. You never come back. This is price of child's life. This is price of questions you planted in women's minds. You give us doubt. We give you exile. She stood preparing to leave, but paused to look at Lars one more time. Her eyes held something that might have been respect or might have been pity. Ayana asked me to tell you something. She says thank you for showing her that cages exist even when they're built from honor and tradition. She says she will spend her life trying to find Doryu. Shoter was there. Then the women were gone, melting back into darkness as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving behind only the medicine bundle and the terrible knowledge of what Lars's presence had caused. He stood staring at the crude map in the dirt, understanding with painful clarity that he had indeed changed something that day. But whether that change would bring freedom or suffering, he would never know. Some doors once opened can never be closed again, and the people who walk through them carry both the weight of possibility and the burden of exile from everything they once knew. The medicine worked. By morning, Emil's horse could bear weight again. The swelling reduced, enough to allow careful travel. They broke camp in silence, each man processing what the night's visitors had revealed. Lars folded the hide-wrapped medicine carefully, though they'd used most of it. He couldn't say why he wanted to keep it, perhaps as evidence that the encounter had been real, that he hadn't imagined the whole impossible situation. They followed the route the old woman had scratched in the dirt, heading north through terrain that grew increasingly rough. The morning sun caught Lars's hair, turning it the color that had caused so much trouble, and he found himself wishing he could somehow make himself less visible, less remarkable. But a man couldn't change what he was born with, couldn't apologize for the simple fact of his appearance. You gonna talk about it? Henrik asked after they'd written in silence for 2 hours. Or would just carry it around like a stone. Lars didn't answer. Immediately, he was thinking about Ayana's message about doors and cages and the price of questions. I destroyed her life, he said finally, just by existing in her sight. You didn't destroy anything, Emil countered, guiding his recovering horse carefully around loose rocks. You just showed her the walls were there. She chose to see them. That's on her, not you. Is it? Would she have questioned anything if we hadn't ridden into that valley? Henrik spat into the dust. Maybe not today. Maybe not this year. But questions don't come from outside. They come from inside, from the part of a person that refuses to accept what they're told without understanding why. You didn't create her doubt. You just gave it a face to focus on. Lars wanted to believe that. Wanted to think he wasn't responsible for whatever suffering is. Presence had caused, but the old woman's words haunted him. Gifts that break open old ways always come with blood. He had given Ayana something, whether he meant to or not. And that gift might cost her everything familiar and safe in her world. They rode through a narrow pass where the walls rose steep on both sides, then emerged into broader territory, where the land opened up before them like a promise of distance and forgetting. Somewhere ahead lay the northern range they'd been seeking, the destination that seemed almost meaningless now compared to what they were leaving behind. You think she'll be all right? Lars asked, surprising himself by voicing the question that had been circling his mind for hours. Emil considered this carefully before answering. I think she's stronger than you're giving her credit for. Woman who stands up to that warrior who follows strangers into darkness to say goodbye. Who tells her people she won't marry the man they chose. That's not someone who breaks easy. She'll find her way. Might not be the way she expected. Might not be the way anyone wanted for her, but it'll be hers. The words offered small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Lars thought about Ayana standing on that rise in the fading light, choosing to speak even when silence would have been safer. She had made her own decisions at every turn. To bring them food, to defend them before the council, to ride out and say goodbye, to refuse a marriage she didn't want. He hadn't forced any of that. He had simply been the catalyst, the foreign element that had made her see choices she hadn't recognized before. We can't go back, Henrik said, reading the direction of Lars's thoughts. You understand that? Takakota meant what he said. Those lands are closed to us now forever. Lars nodded, accepting the exile that came with being seen, with being different, with accidentally showing. Someone that their world had more possibilities than they had been allowed to imagine. It seemed a small price to pay for a life saved and a mind awakened, even if the awakening came with pain. They rode on through country. That grew gentler as they put more distance between themselves and Apache territory. The sun moved across the sky in its eternal pattern, indifferent to the small dramas of the people beneath it. By late afternoon, they could see the northern mountains rising in the distance, their destination finally within reach. But Lars found himself looking back more often than forward, his eyes drawn to the southern horizon, where somewhere beyond sight, a young woman was learning to live with questions that had no easy answers. He hoped she would find peace in her searching, hoped the door he'd inadvertently shown her would lead somewhere worth the journey. But mostly, he hoped she would remember what he'd seen in her during their brief encounters. Not just curiosity about his appearance, but the fierce intelligence and courage that had driven her to question everything she'd been taught to accept without examination. Some people spend their whole lives in cages and never know the bars are there. Others see them clearly and choose to stay. Anyway, finding safety in familiar boundaries. But a rare few see the bars and can't stop themselves from testing them, pushing against them, looking for the spaces between where freedom might slip through. Ayana was that rare kind, and whether his presence had cursed her or freed her, Elle suspected she would have found her way to those bars eventually. He had simply arrived at the moment when she was ready to see them for what they were. That knowledge didn't erase his guilt, but made it bearable. And as the sun began its descent toward evening, Lars finally turned his face forward toward the unknown territory ahead, carrying with him the weight of an encounter that had changed more than he'd ever intended. 3 weeks passed before Lars and his companions reached the northern settlements. 3 weeks of hard travel through country that gradually shed its harshness, becoming gentler as they moved away from the territories where his appearance had caused such upheaval. The horse recovered fully. Emil and Henrik settled back into their familiar rhythms, and life resumed the patterns it had held before they descended into that valley, and changed everything without meaning to. But Lars carried the encounter differently than his companions did. For them, it became a story to tell over drinks. The time they nearly died in Apache country because women couldn't stop staring. They shaped it into adventure, into narrow escape, into proof of how dangerous the frontier could be when cultures collided. They weren't wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. For Lars, it remained something else, something that sat heavier and reached deeper than mere adventure. He thought about Ayana often, wondering what path she had chosen, whether her defiance had cost her the safety of her community or earned her a different kind of respect. He would never know. The exile was absolute, the boundaries clear. Those lands were closed to him forever, and with them, any chance of learning how her story ended. But 6 months after the encounter, a trader passing through the northern settlements brought news that reached Lars through the loose network of frontier communication. Word had spread of an Apache woman who had refused her arranged marriage and left her tribe to join a mixed community at the boundary. Territories, a place where displaced people from various tribes lived alongside trappers, traders, and those who didn't fit cleanly into any single world. The trader mentioned her name in passing, Ayana. She had walked through the door, not easily, not without cost, but she had done it. She was building a life on her own terms in the spaces between worlds. Neither fully Apache nor fully part of the settler culture, but something new, something that belonged only to her. When Lars heard the news, he felt something release in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched tight. She was alive. She was free. Whatever price she'd paid for her choices. She had paid it willingly and survived the transaction. That was all he could have hoped for, all he had any right to know. The news changed something in Lars, too. He had been carrying guilt like a burden, as if his mere existence had destroyed something precious. But hearing that Ayana had not only survived, but actively chosen a new path, made him understand what Henrik had tried to tell him during their ride north. He hadn't destroyed her life. He had simply been present at the moment, when she was ready to see the walls that had always been there. The courage to step beyond them had been entirely her own. Years would pass. Lars would grow older, his blonde hair turning gray then, white, his face weathering into the landscape of a life fully lived. He would tell the story sometimes, carefully edited, leaving out the parts that felt too personal to share. But he never forgot what it meant. That moment, when two people from incompatible worlds had seen each other clearly and recognized something universal in the seeing. He never returned to Apache territory. The exile held, and he honored it. But he carried the memory of fierce dark eyes meeting his across impossible distance, of a young woman choosing questions over answers, uncertainty over safety, freedom over the comfort of known boundaries. That memory became part of him, woven into the fabric of who he was and who he would become. And sometimes when sunlight caught his hair just right, and strangers stared a moment too long, he thought about how something as simple as appearance could open doors or close them, could create bridges or burn them, could change lives without ever intending to. He thought about the responsibility that came with being seen as different, with representing possibility to someone who had never imagined alternatives existed. The frontier was full of encounters between different worlds, some violent, some peaceful, most somewhere in between. But occasionally, very rarely those encounters transcended their circumstances and became something more. They became moments when human beings looked past difference and recognized each other not as threats or curiosities, but as people facing the same fundamental questions about how to live with honor in a world that rarely made such choices easy. Lars Vitmo, live a long life. He partnered with Emil and Henrik on various ventures, built something resembling success, and eventually settled in a territory where his appearance was unremarkable. But he never forgot the day he rode into a valley and became, without intending it, the catalyst for someone else's freedom. And he never stopped hoping that wherever Ayana's path had taken her, she had found something worth the courage it took to choose it. Some stories end cleanly. Others end with people walking in different directions, carrying with them the weight and gift of having truly seen each other. This was the second kind. And years later, when travelers occasionally mentioned an Apache woman living in the boundary territories who had built a life unlike anything her people had known before, Lars would smile slightly and think she found her door. She walked through it, and whatever lay on the other side, she had earned it through her own strength and determination. That was enough. It had to be enough because some encounters change us in ways we can never fully understand. And all we can do is honor them by continuing forward, carrying the lessons they taught us about courage, choice, and the beautiful, terrible complexity of being human in a world that insists on drawing lines between different kinds of people. Lars carried those lessons until the day he died, and they made him better than he might have been otherwise. And somewhere in the boundary territories, a woman with fierce dark eyes built a life that honored both where she came from and where she chose to go. Two people, two worlds, one brief encounter that proved some connections transcend the boundaries meant to keep them apart. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier where courage and fate collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.